my zip code is 60620.
Okay.
60620. 60620. For me, to have poverty, to see poverty defined as disaster was mind blowing for me. You know, you look at poverty and you're looking at eradicating poverty and you're looking at programs, but to see it as a disaster, that was something new to me, you know, and that was kind of what I walked away with here.
Thank you. I'm going to get to our panel, come back to you guys in just a little bit, but we wanted to just hear some of the immediate reactions. I think we had very rich dialogue from the folks out there. Here's the filmmaker. You can't wait to talk. Say your name. What do you want to say?
My name's Judith. I want to say thank you to you. What's your name?
Pamela.
Pamela, thank you. It really validated this whole process.
Okay.
Good. Thank you. And say your name. Well, you have a mic, right?
I think I might have. Is it still on?
It is.
Okay, I was worried I was the cause of the feedback.
No.
Okay.
It's never you.
I'm supposed to say my name.
Yeah, name and organization. I'm going to keep it rolling that way.
Okay. Hey folks, I'm Juliana Pino, and I'm the policy director of the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. Thanks for staying.
And thank you for coming.
I'm Susy Schultz, and I run a little nonprofit called Public Narrative. I teach and train people about storytelling, both in community as well as journalists.
My name is Jahmal Cole. I'm the founder of My Block, My Hood, My City. Our philosophy is democracy starts from a block, and we shovel snow for seniors and help out a lot of block clubs in Chicago.
Thank you so much. We've got all generations, lots of perspectives here. Some of the things that connect these folks, I actually know them all, some for longer than others, but they're all committed to social justice, healthy communities, understanding that voice matters and place is important. And I think the other thing that connects them, they're all amazing communicators, able to tell their stories, and they understand the importance of narrative, and I think that that was part of your goal as a filmmaker, to look at how different the stories are based on who's telling them. The nonviolent deaths, the different euphemisms that we heard, you know, heat emergency, human emergency, the fire hydrants being turned off while Buckingham Fountain was just pouring away downtown. All of those things were really amazing to see, and you did an excellent job of doing it. But Juliana, I'll start with you. What's your reaction to what you saw, and perhaps something that you didn't know?
Yes, I think something, so I'll start with something that I didn't know. I didn't know that there were disaster preparedness exercises in Chicago. I'd heard about them happening in other places and was equally appalled. I think my immediate reactions were that it confirms, I think, the systematic, patterned continuation of these policies of exclusion and marginalization in Chicago today. And, you know, in Little Village, the community where our organization is based, we have somewhere between 90,000 and 100,000 people. At the non-industrial part of the neighborhood is denser than New York City in terms of the number of people that live there, and we're just one of many community areas that are planned by right by the city as targets for industrial pollution. So if you think about that, those areas are where lots of people are, but also current policies still target these places for ongoing racial discrimination. And the maps, they talked about the really important map about redlining. The current maps around the city of Chicago demonstrate that these outcomes aren't just the result of historical policy decisions. And you saw with the FEMA official this idea of the problem of many hands. When you have lots of different administrations, lots of different departments targeting problems from different angles, it's easy for everyone to say, it wasn't us, right? Do you recognize this? This physical position? You see it on the TV? They can say it's somebody else's fault. And we see that in Chicago systematically. And I think another thing that I noticed was the real siloing of how we address these issues. For example, if we militarize and involve the police in any sort of approach to mitigating disaster, whether it's the slow, long-term version related to poverty, inequality, and other kinds of oppression, or the immediate climate disasters, human-produced climate disasters, that's going to immediately render the disaster response inaccessible to huge swaths of community that do not want to interact with the police. So we have to think about what we mean when we say infrastructure, who we're going to be resourcing, and ensure that we're addressing the actual problems in any climate response plan that we have. You know, the city is at the point at which it's developing a resiliency plan. This plan is largely going to involve things like planting trees, like you saw at City Hall. What it's not going to involve is addressing divestment. It's not going to involve the city's divestment from these continued polluting industries that are accelerating climate change. It doesn't tackle transportation as the biggest cause of climate pollution in Illinois. It doesn't tackle the city's transportation corridors. It doesn't tackle the idea that the city's interaction with capitalism relies on these places where black and brown bodies are devalued as dumping grounds so that the rest of the city can run.
Thank you so much. And you saw that silence. Yeah, give it up. That silence when they said, why isn't anybody going to the police station to cool off? Crickets.
Hello?
My response or
Yes.
my,
And anything new that you learned?
anything, well, you know, I found it a wonderful compendium. I was interested when I heard exactly what it was about. I lived through that during the reporting while I was at the Chicago Sun-Times. But since I had children, I was in the features department. When you procreate, you go to features. And so I was not able to really report on that. But and then I was at the Chicago Department of Public Health later, knew Steve. And you went to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and actually found out about disaster drills at Y2K when I was on duty at midnight guarding your safety. The amazing amount of money that was spent across the country to make sure that when computers turned over, not everything went haywire. And not a damn thing happened. And it was, I have a little hat and a little shirt, I keep it, just to remember how ridiculous it all was. So there was a compendium of different things that intersected almost my career. And I loved the way you took those deaths and made them relevant to what was going on today. And all the information that you're talking about the stress and the relation of health. I mean, there is a reason why there are racial disparities in healthcare, in not only healthcare, but in health outcomes. Black, brown, you are more likely than black men are the most at risk for dying of heart disease, dying of diabetes. If you are Hispanic, the chances of you losing a limb when you have diabetes are bigger.
And let me just ask you, staying on you for a second in your field, what did you think when you saw, I'm a former journalist, recovering journalist, when you saw the happy talk and the way people covered this? What's your takeaway from that?
It was an era where unless you were an investigative reporter or unless you were on what people at that time called Pulitzer pushes, so let's do a whole big look at some one thing, that people were not asked to go deeper than a puddle. They were not asked to look at the root causes. And you know, I will say this, we're in that era as well now. There are some amazing places out there, but we are very siloed in our journalism and the journalism we get. And the journalists that I see, I asked them once, I had a panel of 4 journalists with 30 kids from Schurz High School, because they were very upset about the coverage of a homicide that was reported to be in front of Schurz. And so we were trying to, let them have voice with the journalists. And I turned to the journalists and I said at one point, how many times do you in a journalism meeting, in a daily story budget meeting, say, how will this story affect the community? And all 4 of them were just like, as though they were like, oh, we never asked that. Oh, we never
Thank
think
you.
that.
You gave the secret sauce. And somebody's wiggling their mic, so just be cautious with that. Thank you. You think it's loose? Thank you, Susie. That's the background that I wanted to hear. Coming to you, Jahmal, so talk about your reaction, anything that you've learned.
Well, I thought it was a good movie, a good documentary. First, thanks for having me. I think that oppression is real, just reinforce that it's a structural part of our country and its history. It was created intentionally, and I think nowadays it's been cloaked up in like a lot of trumped up laws and false media. And I think we have a hard time recognizing how injustice is being sustained, especially in Chicago. I feel like you can't really, when I look at the stats for African American males, when you see 1 out of every 100 black men graduate college by their 25 or by the time they're 26, it's kind of depressing. So even though kids grow up in poverty in Chicago, I try to tell them not to have a poverty of imagination. So I want kids to step outside their comfort zone and explore different parts of Chicago. Because you know what, if you grow up in these divested communities in Chicago, a lot of kids I work with, they order their breakfast every day through bulletproof glass windows, like we saw in the movie, right? The glass is so thick they have to yell their order. That's why kids are always trying to yell to get what they want. They say, "Hey man, I want the Doritos." No, not the spicy nacho, the blue bag. And then the guy goes to get it. He drops it in a bulletproof glass jar and he slides it out to you like you're an inmate in solitary confinement, but you're just on 79th and State. German Shepherds sniff us when we get on the train in the morning going to school. Helicopters, my daughter knew what a helicopter was before she knew what a butterfly was, right? They fly up and down your house like it's dragonflies. When I look at in my community, there's 15 currency exchanges and no banks. Like, so if you ask a kid what's a job at a bank, they're like, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, there's every other billboard in my community promotes cheap divorces and $6,000 tax advances. You know what I mean? There's a liquor store in every other corner. You might as well get drunk. There's a holding cell in the basement of a funeral home. You know what I mean? Like, that's not regular, right? You see things like you kids pull up to the school and there's paddy wagons parked outside the front of the school. You got to take your belt off and take your shoes off just to go through a metal detector to get to the school. You know what I mean? That's not regular. It's not regular for kids to have to go to the bathroom in school and there's no toilet paper or there's no paper towels. They're expected to learn filth. Like, this isn't regular for kids to have 12 substitute teachers in schools and there's only 15 teachers in the whole school. So I feel like when I think about, obviously, the movie and saying that it's a disaster, these things are a disaster, I think that we need to expose ourselves to different parts. We need to step outside our comfort zone and develop empathy towards the suffering of other people. And that's something you can only do when you travel outside of your neighborhood and go, travel further south than 35th Street just for once and check it out.
Well, and you do a good job of that with your social media. There's folks following you and perhaps learning more about communities than they ever would. How deep that goes beyond liking something we have to see. I want to address one comment to the filmmaker and then come to you guys if you're ready. If you think you have a question, do me a favor. Who has a mic? There's a mic here. Maybe just stand up and kind of be ready with your question, your brief question. I was doing some work on public television and I was blown away by Henry Louis Gates' Reconstruction documentary, and that after Civil War period explains so much. And then when I see your maps and your redlining maps and your Steve Whitman layer upon layer and all those other great activists that you had, maps, how did you make those leaps to build such a thorough through line to the crises? Because these things have existed. Filmmakers weren't telling that story. What motivated you to go so deep and to make such connections?
Well, it all started with Dr. Whitman's map, but it was so clear that there were maps underneath and there were maps above. So we just kept on imagining these maps that went we just kept on imagining these maps at every layer. And we had to. I mean, there's this is not a one-off. This is the impact of very long-term structural racism. So, when we started this movie, it wasn't like that. But sort of, as this movie continued, I mean, it was really, honestly, it was going to be like a one-off. We were only going to look at that heat wave, and we knew that even if we only looked at that heat wave for a fixed period of time, we'd be able to tell kind of a whodunit. I mean, it would be a murder mystery meets the climate crisis. But then Katrina happened very soon after, 6 weeks after that interview with Eric Kleinenberg, and there was no way we could leave it like that. So it just got deeper and deeper, and I really am interested in the power of words and what happens when you change them. Laws are just words that are put together in certain kinds of sentences, and then we get used to them. There's no reason why we can't rewrite them. So at some point, I really do want to ask Jahmal and you, what do you think about, I don't know if it's the right way, but when I saw all of that money and I saw all of that disaster preparedness, I was just amazed at the empathy that people had as long as it was a certain kind of disaster. But they were talking about the most vulnerable people. They were stockpiling diabetes medication in their tabletop. They were stockpiling asthma medication. They were stockpiling all the stuff that the people in those communities are absolutely gonna need.
But you can't get it now.
But you can't get it now, and we can't give you the healthcare that you need that would actually mediate that so that you don't need it. But if you redefine all of that as a public health crisis and an emergency, what happens? If you redefine Jahmal and Little Village as a new brand of first responders, I don't see why we can't invest disaster dollars into their infrastructure.
Thank you. I'm just gonna keep it going, because isn't she amazing? And I wanna make sure that we, don't see a lot of questions yet, so if you want one, jump up. But let me just ask you guys that,
What do you think about do you like that idea?
the framing, so Jahmal, it looks like you wanna jump in.
Yeah, I feel like, you know what? Chicago is definitely very segregated, so the distinction between the black, the white, the brown communities, that's very visible, and that's created these diverging or these separate community areas. That racial division is important, not only because it signifies a lack of cultural integration in Chicago, but segregation creates socioeconomic isolation and exclusion, in which minorities, specifically African Americans, have higher vulnerability to poverty and crime. You know what? I tell the kids that I work with that we don't have time to be waiting for people to give us. If you're gonna be waiting forever, you're gonna be waiting forever. I mean, like, the fact of it is that poverty in Chicago is upper middle class in Mexico. It's upper class in Zimbabwe. You can't go around saying, "Oh, I'm in poverty" when you're wearing Jordans or when you got a microwave. I know it's easy to think that way, but if you like, poverty for me was a blessing. I felt like, because it taught me how to be resilient, and I didn't know a food stamp wasn't real money until I put one in a pop machine. And I felt like if it wasn't for me growing up like that, I would have, this is just the only way I grew up. So poverty for me is a blessing, and I think that, for me was a blessing. But I feel like a lot of kids in Chicago, you know what they say? I'm a product of my environment. I'm a victim of my circumstances. I'm not even supposed to make it to 18. I'm like, bro, you're a product of your expectations. You're not a product of your environment. I mean, your environment affects your well-being, I understand that, but you're not a product of that. So to get these kids to, if you show people better, they can do better, and that's just my little solution to it.
Well, thank you for your role modeling. That's very valuable, but then the challenges that kids face on health and other issues, it's more than the bootstraps, right? It's a little more than attitude. Juliana?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when I said before about rethinking the infrastructure, I also mean rethinking the flow of resources to the really small scale, highly localized, local expertise-based solutions that we actually need to respond to long-term crisis, to respond to immediate climate disaster. And that in Chicago would look like immediately reopening public schools. It would look like shutting down a number of different highly specialized COP facilities that aren't needed and that aren't wanted in communities. Police-oriented development is a real problem here. It would immediately look like putting in controls so that industrial polluters had to move out of neighborhoods where they've been making people sick for decades. And it would also look like reinvesting in the kinds of regenerative ideas that the people who have been left behind and oppressed by the state have been doing for years to survive with no resources. As Jahmal notes, folks are really resourceful, and in their resistance, they've been able to grow their own food. They've been able to make emergency plans because at any time they might be targeted by the state. They might be left abandoned by the city. And that's a reality for people. And so when we're looking at how we're gonna survive and how we're going to invest in quote unquote disaster preparedness, people already know what they're gonna do. And we actually need to learn from folks who are disabled, from folks who are undocumented, from folks who are Black and Indigenous, who have been working on this for years and have a lot to teach us, except we don't trust their knowledge as expertise. And instead, people who are largely white, largely technocrats are writing laws in little rooms without ever talking to the communities that those laws are supposed to be about and I contend are supposed to be written by.
Thank you, that's amazing. Susie, and then I know you want to speak, but did I see another hand of someone who hasn't spoken? Let's have that person then you, after Susie.
I was just gonna say, at the heart of it all is the way government is set up, which is, it's not set up to look at long-term issues. It's set up to respond and put up a facade that says, look what we're doing, look at the law we made, look at how. We actually have maps, childhood opportunity maps, within the public health departments, the Cook County Public Health. Terry Mason, Dr. Terry Mason will talk to you about them. So in other words, as a society, and you know, public health, the Department of Public Health, what public health is supposed to do has nothing to do with medicine. It's supposed to look at our outcomes. It's supposed to look at how we grow and how we develop. Where are the deserts? Where are the problems? And how can we, as a public, work through for better outcomes? And I think if more people understood, we have that information, more people would be able to compel government to say, listen, you know, or say to government, listen, this is what you have to do, this is your job. This, you have the information, you've been collecting it, what the hell are you doing with it?
Act on it, and that's what one of our audience members was talking about with the taxes. Question or comment from the back, please, and tell us your zip code.
60647. Question for somebody in journalism. A couple of years ago, the city of Chicago put out, and the Department of Public Health put out a very slick book called Healthy Chicago 2.0. It has a lot of great information, and one after another of the problems that it lists is something that the Emanuel administration took steps to make worse. And as far as I know, I didn't see any journalistic examination of that book and how, what a PR thing it was and how hypocritical it was to be listing all these problems that we were going to solve when in fact the administration was making them worse. So can you comment on the journalism, the lack of it?
I'd be happy to. I think one thing that we forget about journalism, one, journalism is written into the Constitution, right? Which is pretty damn amazing. And that makes journalists the fourth estate, the three branches of government and the fourth estate. And what we spend a lot of time at Public Narrative talking about is that you all are the fifth estate. You are the fifth estate, and you are the people, you are the watchdogs that should be keeping the watchdogs on track. We have abdicated also, right now we have a journalism industry that is at a very low point. Not only are they under attack by the government, they are also fewer and fewer of them than there ever were. I was in the Sun-Times newsroom, and our journalism, our union group was somewhere in the neighborhood of 800. There's maybe 200 there now. So how is it that they can cover this? I think what happens is, what we need to do as people is not only support journalism and also good nonprofit journalism as well, but we also need to engage with journalists and say, I don't care. I don't really care about this story you have on the front. I would like to know, I would like somebody to analyze this public health plan. I would like somebody to do that. And I will tell you, which is amazing, it's not just angry people calling. The effect of readers, listeners calling journalism outlets is phenomenal.
It hasn't died down. People think that that's diminished. It hasn't gone away. And remember, this is an area where money still talks. Critical analysis and media analysis go hand in hand. And we have a president who is every day trying to make journalists the enemy. So there's a lot of battles on a lot of fronts. And I'll just give one tiny bit of history. Journalists were at a low point with George Bush the second, because there was so much propaganda and so many people trained to keep journalists down to a point where in his White House press room, if you were from People magazine, you'd get called on before the New York Times, and that was part of Donald Rumsfeld, and journalists stayed down. Katrina made people start to buck up again and to say, we've got to wake up and start covering things, and now we're again, as Susie said, at a low point. So
Can I just
tell
say,
your outlets.
Can I just say that When we look at the state of the media, there's actually, the Associated Press actually reports on this and looks at what administrations are doing, what they are not asking, whether they are moving people further away, how many Freedom of Information Acts. And when the AP reported in the last year of the Obama administration, they said Bush was bad, Obama was worse. In that he kept the media at bay, even though we looked as though we all fought. So it's a constant thing with power. It's not necessarily the person, it's the institution. And the institution is always trying to self-perpetuate itself. It's trying to self-perpetuate, there we go. Everybody needs an editor. And so we have to remember that we as people can actually push back on a lot of those things, and the media are the ones asking questions for us. So are they asking the right questions? That's what we should be telling them.
Juliana, and then our comment in the audience.
Yes, I just wanted to mention something about Healthy Chicago 2.0. So what's interesting to me is the city invested a lot in the PR strategy around that health study, which is where a lot of the points that you made came up. What they don't say is that Healthy Chicago 2.0 largely focuses on individual responsibility for public health outcomes. So you saw an overstudying of things like diabetes, and what is the quote-unquote responsibility of the person experiencing that health outcome for the reason that they're sick. And I find that deeply, deeply, deeply problematic. Because it completely does not address the kinds of things we were seeing the director here cover in the movie around the social and structural causes of health outcomes. You didn't see anything about environmental health in a city that's the origin point of environmental justice. Where on the southeast side, you had Hazel Johnson identify and give her neighborhood of Altgeld Gardens the nickname the Toxic Donut, because at the time, which is over 20 years ago, they were surrounded by 300 industrial facilities. On the map, you would see them in the most saturated color under the shortest life expectancy and the highest rates of breast cancer deaths. Where was that in Healthy Chicago 2.0?
And you've done so much work in your community, which continues to struggle with that same issue. It's almost like inheriting the next level of those challenges.
That's right. And so I just have to say, question the conclusions that any administration is coming to, anyone in power, when they're telling you we're doing everything we can.
Last question from the audience, or comment briefly, please, and then we'll give a wrap up here, because I think we've got,
There's a woman
yeah, I do
halfway-
see you
halfway
in there.
down.
There
She
might
raised
be
her
like
hand.
3 questions.
Okay, I'm good. So,
Very
gentlemen who
quickly.
spoke before, please briefly.
I believe your organization, Juliana, was involved with the shutdown of the coal-fired power plants, because that was a struggle we were also part of from the staff of Cook County. So I think that was great. Quickly, I really enjoyed the editorial, or the op-ed that you guys wrote, the director wrote in the Trib. But I had a question for you, and that is, several years back, the director, I don't know if you encountered anyone, there was a heat wave in Europe, it was about like 15 years ago, I think, where 17,000 people died, and I'm wondering if there was any conclusions drawn, and maybe they could have learned from our experience here, they could have prevented their experience. It's just, I wasn't clear on as to why that happened.
Great
Thank you.
question. Your mic to the woman in blue, or the person behind you? Okay. Did you want to answer that?
So you're asking me, well, I do know that they did not know about Eric's book, and they were very sorry that they didn't know about Eric's book, but they were even more sorry that they didn't understand it, that it wasn't given to them, that it wasn't made very clear from the city that this story could have been turned into something that everybody really truly could have used.
So Chicago didn't make it a point to go out and say, this is what we've learned, here's how we can help you.
Absolutely not.
Coming back to the questionnaire, please, your zip code.
60611. My name is Tina. In talking about language and redefining what disaster means, I noticed that in the map that maps the heat wave deaths with the people who had the highest rate of federal poverty level. Should we redefine federal poverty level? Because just in my research, and I was a grad student recently, and I mean, just defining how poor you are, and are you poor enough to get food stamps? Are you poor enough to get these resources dealt to you? While there are a lot of food insecure people and other types of people that need assistance but aren't deemed poor enough by the state based on the definition of the federal poverty level. So I was wondering if that's something that would be a positive change to redefine that, or if that's just getting too focused on one bit of the problem.
Thank you. Susie has a language point.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I'll hold them because I want other folks to get a chance to get them out.
All I would say is that, from my time in federal government, I would say that discussion, it's not gonna be compelled unless people compel it, unless there is. It is so anathema to everybody, the minute they get up to that point of talking about, we have to change this, because the way to define poverty for people is now, it's certain programs you qualify for, you have to be 200% above, it's ridiculous,
Yeah, it's
200% above, the poverty level means nothing. So I totally understand what you're talking about, but I think that, again, it's going to have to take compelling this, nobody wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Juliana?
Yes, so I would say that that's definitely an issue. There's the general construct under federal assistance programs is, again, goes back to what proof do you have to provide that you deserve this handout, right? It's not about a guarantee of a basic living income to every family. It's not about a guarantee to dignified work. It's not about a guarantee to food that's healthy and culturally responsive. And so that level, setting a level, is baked into the ideology behind the food program. And segue, I did food justice work years back. We still do it at El Vejo, even though that's not my focus, because now I'm in policy, changing the laws. And even those programs emerged out of farming surpluses that came out of federal subsidies, where the federal government gave too much to certain industrial industries, suddenly had too much food of certain kinds, and had to figure out what to do with it. It didn't come out of trying to solve for people's human needs. And so really remembering that and keeping that clearly at the forefront really explains the many problems of the assistance programs, knowing how freaking crucial they are for people's survival. But yes, treating needs on a spectrum would be much more appropriate to people's complex realities, and also not making people prove again and again and again that they deserve things. We're starting to see policies in other states that are requiring people not use substances, requiring that people never get fired, requiring that people not have someone in their family who is incarcerated. I mean, stuff that's just completely egregious when it really should be based on human beings have a right to survive and to thrive in a way that's not going to be oppressive or demoralizing or demeaning.
I think that deserves applause. You also saw in the film the work. It's 7 a.m. You're there lined up as an elder with all your papers in order to get this small handout. Well, did you have one more question there? Okay? And then we'll get your final comments.
I'm Merle Karras-Gross, and I live in 60611.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say a couple of things we know about how disastrous blaming the victim is, which sounds like what that healthcare 2.0 is. But I wanted to say that 77, loud and clear, that signing on to email whatever, I support this, I support that, is not as effective as making a call to your elected official, your local elected officials, and raising new items. You not just calling about, oh, Senate bill this or House bill that, but raising new issues that we want our government officials to look at. We need to demand that.
Thank you, and I think Susie's saying that with journalists, and you're saying that with elected officials as well. So this has been a very rich conversation. We could go on, but we want to be respectful of people's time. I'd like to ask each of our panelists to wrap up with their final thoughts. I'm going to just start to say how important language is. It goes back to so many things, whether you are a victim or you are a rioter, whether you are pro-choice or pro-abortion. We have had so many boondoggles played on people because of the way that some folks can manipulate language and use it to help others not feel guilty and to justify things that are happening right now in our society. So that language is important, and there was a move a few years ago, some of the health folks could talk about this or remember this, where gun violence was called a health crisis. And so it made new allies, it made people who didn't look at who looked at gun violence a certain way, they understood it as a health crisis as well. So language counts in so many ways, and there's so many important things to watch. Jahmal, can you share your last thoughts and maybe a takeaway or a call to action that you would give to people?
I just would not wait for big city government to change anything. When I told my coach in college, he said, Jahmal, you got a great attitude. Why do you have a 1.7 GPA? I said, people treat me racist. I hate the food. It's cold outside. I ain't got no money. He said, Jahmal, you know what's missing from your list? I said, what? He said, your name's not on it. No excuses. The highest level of maturity is taking full responsibility for your actions. And I say that to say, you ask some people in Chicago, why does your block look like this? You know what they say? The alderman's messed up, the city's messed up, the government, their philosophy is messed up to me, right? Because instead of blaming stuff on other people, they can say, what could I make myself do today that'll have a positive impact on my block? What can I make myself? That gives you a little power, right? And so my philosophy is, what's something simple I can do that'll have a positive impact on my block?
Thank you.
I don't think I could say anything that better. I'm constantly bombarded. The trajectory of my career has been rather funky, but most of it has led me to the idea that language matters, action matters. And if you are not walking the walk as every day, you know, you're really not doing what you should do as part of a society, even for yourself and for the rest. And so I would really, really urge you to think about what it is you can do constantly to make the call, to write the letter, this morning we spent a lot of time with a group of people in the dealing with making sure that people who are outside of different neighborhoods that may be targeted tomorrow by ICE, Gage Park, back of the yards, Pilsen, that we go there tomorrow and we have lunch, we have coffee, we have dinner. We are there to witness and to accompany neighborhoods who are living under a terrorist act. It's a terrorist act that will happen tomorrow in 9 cities if it does. So just think that sometimes your presence can just be important.
Thank you, Susie. Juliana?
Thank you for raising that, Susie. I think a couple of things. One is to remember that one of the drivers of all of these different realities for folks, other than what we've mentioned before, anti-Black racism, colonial extraction, and a number of other root causes, is isolation, right? It's like a secondary driver. And what we need are people who are invested in connecting with the community around them and to facilitate other communities to have the ability to exercise their right to do that. And so that means to examine your role and what you could do to prevent things like displacement and gentrification. What could you be doing to organize to make the city reevaluate its housing policies? Because on a fundamental level, the inability to hold on to a place to live is underlining every other thing that we are dealing with here. And I would also argue that immigration's customs enforcement and policing in general, not just immigration policing, and we know that despite some level of city direction, there's still active collaboration. The expansion and the reliance on policing as a measure of security also eliminates the ability for communities to connect with each other and remain out of isolation. So things you could do are to support anti-police brutality activists, Black-led community organizations in struggling against the city for more police oversight, so that when events like what potentially could happen tomorrow are happening, that it's not made so much worse by the collaboration from our local officials. And in terms of tomorrow and the next couple of weeks, I would urge you to move with caution if you are going to be in communities that aren't your own. That's also sometimes a force of gentrification, right? Especially if you're going to places where maybe you're not invited. I think just move with caution. Make sure that you're taking the lead from folks who do this work every day so that you're not potentially exacerbating the problem or causing additional fear, right? Because gentrification also causes fear. And I would say, learn all of the Know Your Rights material. Learn what you as a person who potentially has citizenship privilege can do if ICE shows up at a coffee shop that you're at a workplace that you're at. Don't ever make assumptions about the documentation status of your neighbors. There are undocumented people of every background, but the folks who fare worse than anybody else are Black undocumented people, Indigenous undocumented people, queer and trans undocumented people, and those folks work with you, are in your community, and need your support. And in order to support them, you have to learn the rights that you have as a potential person with citizenship, and that you can intervene when you see an ICE agent approach somebody. You can stop them, you can film them, you can refuse to give your documentation in solidarity, and there are things you can do. You can report any sightings to various hotlines. And so take the time to educate yourself. If you do one thing tonight, go home and do that.
You guys made the choice to be here. We thank you so much for being in the right place, educating yourselves, being in solidarity. How you choose to act on it is up to you, and we encourage you to be thoughtful, reflect that time to sit back and to know yourself and how you're moving through the world and how your actions impact others is always a great thing to do. There's a postcard out there on the table that is addressed to Mayor Lightfoot, encouraging her to look at the language around how we talk about racism and racism as it impacts public health, and I encourage you to do that. And I will just give the last words and ask you to give another round of applause to our filmmaker.
So we created this postcard because just a couple of weeks ago, the Milwaukee County and the city of Milwaukee, they did a pretty historic thing. We think it's historic, and it has a lot to do with language. So they signed a resolution that they were going to declare racism is a public health crisis in the county of Milwaukee and in the city, because they felt like if they could redefine it like that, then they would have the power as legislators to actually do something. Now, I think that will be only as good as the grassroots is able to push them to really actually utilize that. But we thought that given the new mayor and the new administration, and certainly when we started this, Mayor Daley was in office, and that's who I thought was going to be receiving this movie. So we think that perhaps this is a very good start. So we hope to, if you sign this and you put your zip code here and your address, we will send it, we'll put the stamp on it, and we hope to flood them with 1,000 or so of these by the end, over the next couple of days in the next 2 weeks. And my hope is that perhaps, if you like the idea, being a new brand of first responder, and we think that in that reframing, we might be able to get disaster dollars invested into the local infrastructure as you define it and in the ways that you want that. Maybe we can help convene some kind of interesting gathering between the so-called disaster masters and what the grassroots is doing and what the public health community is doing. And so over the next 2 weeks, we have 7 more discussions that are like this. Go to our website, cookedthefilm.com, and you'll see each night is dedicated to a different theme and for us to kind of push this through.
And urge everyone you know to come and see it.
Yes, please invite
Okay,
everyone.
invite everybody. I love the passion here. I know you guys, some of you have emails, websites, anything you want to share as we head out the door? I'm with Elevate Energy. We do a lot of energy, climate work, equity, and it's Elevate Energy, just spelled like that, .org.
Yes, folks, if you want to follow up with any of our organizations, please look us up. Also, if you don't remember the URL, Google us. We're lvejo.org, but also I wanted to put a plug in for something if you feel really overwhelmed or you're unable to support or show up for people in person. Another really good thing you can do with the impending ICE raids is give money to bail people out of detention facilities. So a place you can do that, there's a URL for a current campaign that's going on right now. It's bit.ly/migrant freedom, and you can give money to national bail fund efforts that would then be redirected to various local organizations around the country who are actively using that money to bail people out.
Nice, thank you. Susie?
Publicnarrative.org.
My website is myblockmyhoodmycity.com.
Thank you, everybody. Have a safe evening.